At NeuFit, we talk about how with injuries, it's not as much about the original injury, but the body's response to it. That's the imprint of that injury on body, mind, and soul. We see delayed recovery from injury, we see chronic pain because of that imprint, and helping people identify where that imprint lives, through mapping, scanning around, finding where that lives, and changing, optimizing, re-educating, recalibrating that imprint neurologically, that neurological pattern, is able to make a profound difference for people.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow.
Hello, NeuFit Nation, and welcome back to the Undercurrent podcast. Today, I'm going to do a solo episode on a new topic. It's a very interesting, very important topic, and it is the topic of trauma. You might be wondering why I'm choosing to do an episode or even multiple episodes on trauma, and there's multiple factors, multiple reasons why, and I'll share them with you before we dive into the content today. The first is that I think that there is an avenue whereby we can really help people who are dealing with trauma. And trauma is rampant between PTSD in veterans of war and military service, between people who have experienced various adverse childhood events, abuse, assault, etc. There's so many people dealing with trauma, and based on some of the experiences that I've seen during treatment, experiences where old memories come up while we're doing treatments with the newbie, for example, or where we're able to help people who are dealing with chronic pain, where there's clearly an influence of old traumas that are causing them to stay locked in that cycle of chronic pain, and we're able to help them. There's all these avenues whereby I really think we can help, and I want to open the dialogue here within NeuFit Nation so that trauma can be on our radar collectively. And I think that many of you listening to this will be able to help people, whether it's more, people coming in with chronic pain, or you're able to, or perhaps you actually do psychological work or counseling work and can use the newbie as an adjunct, or collaborate with someone locally who's, someone doing more body-based physical therapy, chiropractic type of work, collaborating with someone who's doing more counseling type work. I think there's really some wonderful avenues to help, and there's a very strong conceptual connection. We've talked on previous episodes about this concept of the threat bucket and the stresses of abuse, neglect, assault, war. Those certainly can fill up somebody's threat bucket and lead to chronic pain and different sorts of health challenges. There's also a really strong conceptual connection. One of the foundational concepts that we talk about here at NeuFit is that when we're working with someone who's been injured, who's experiencing pain, it's not as much about the original injury as it is about the neurological response, about the body's response to that injury or trauma. Of course, that's a neurological response. It's the brain and nervous system imposing patterns of tension, inhibition, hypersensitivity that leads to chronic pain, imposing those patterns on the body. And we're able to help people in profound ways that change the trajectory of their rehabilitation, help them recover faster, improve function, sometimes even in one session in dramatic ways. So there's opportunities to really leverage those same approaches and technology and methods to help people who are dealing with trauma. There's also, in terms of a little bit of the background and context and why I felt compelled to do an episode like this and open up the dialogue on this topic here in NeuFit Nation. There's a few books that I've read that have really spoken to me, in very profound ways. One is The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And that's a great one. Much of the content in this episode is definitely inspired by or directly from that book. So I want to give him credit. Also another great book, Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine, is a great one. And then a few books I've read on the Feldenkrais method, Somatics by Thomas Hanna, who I believe was actually the person who brought Moshe Feldenkrais over here to the United States decades ago. So really, it's something that I've been learning about over the years, and just again keep seeing these connections between different patients and clients that we've worked with here in Austin, or different stories I've heard from practitioners around the world. And I think there's a way to help. One other thing that I also want to share on the topic in terms of background, I had some pretty wonderful experiences mentoring, observing a physiological psychologist. So early on in my career, many years ago, I was observing treatments that this gentleman was doing, and he was trained by Marion Rosen, who was part of the lineage of people who in Europe had worked with Carl Jung and were doing the body work and movement-based therapies that would help, as they would describe it, they would help loosen the emotional associations so that their talk therapy could be more effective. So anyway, he would do these treatments where he would help people release different patterns of tension, and that would actually, because our brains are monitoring, this interoception, our brains are monitoring what the body and what feedback the brains get from the body, that piecing that together creates the identity. And so if you change patterns of tension, there's actually an opportunity to literally change someone's sense of their self, who they are, their identity. That influences, of course, beliefs and behaviors and ultimately outcomes. But I would see, for example, treatments where like one that stands out where, he would do a treatment with this guy and help him just release these deep-seated patterns of tension and protection. And he would he went into convulsions and, would spit up like phlegm and all this stuff. And after a few minutes of that, he literally looked 10 to 15 years younger. He was a changed person. So it shows to me, one of the big lessons, coming through that was seeing how the physical patterns of tension in the body, how deeply that influences the psychology. So it's a two-way street. The brain, of course, influences the body, controls the body in many ways, but how the body is organized and oriented and functioning, that influences the brain. So that, we could be having an otherwise calm day, but if the body's holding tight here, the brain might see that and say, "Oh my gosh, the body's tight. There must be something to be concerned about." And so it might upregulate the protective or sense of alarm, hypervigilance might kind of upregulate those circuits. And it's definitely a two-way street. And so this is just kind of all the different factors that have gotten me interested in this topic and inspired me to record this episode, and at least one more that we have queued up on the topic of trauma as well, and hopefully more in the future. But turning now to the topic at hand, I want to give a little bit of background. This is something that was shocking to me in reading The Body Keeps the Score and some other resources, how rampant trauma is in our society today. So a few statistics that struck me. One is that 28% of women and 16% of men have had sexual abuse attempted on them. A dramatic number of people, is somewhere between like 1 in 6 to 1 in 8 people have seen their mother be seriously abused. The effects on health are pretty profound. Traumatized children, for example, are 50 times more likely to have asthma. And there's something that we'll get into later, is the effect of trauma on the immune system and the body and on health. So there's a lot there where trauma can have profound negative consequences for health, including also leading to higher rates of depression, chronic pain, rates of people dropping out of school and having less success in their careers, higher incidences of major illnesses like cardiovascular disease and cancer, also alcoholism and addiction, and helping people work through the ill effects of trauma can be a profoundly positive influence on societal problems related to addiction and disease rates, and also overcrowded jails and different social problems. So just a really, really powerful avenue to help people individually and more broadly across society. So as we kind of look at the topic of trauma, I think it's very important to to understand what's actually happening in the brain of someone who has experienced trauma. So this could be the trauma of childhood abuse, neglect, the trauma of a military veteran who was at war, trauma of someone who's been in a car accident, or different types of trauma. But there's a couple stereotypical patterns that I think are very, very important to understand, because it helps us understand what's really happening mechanistically and also start to think about some avenues whereby we can help. And the first sort of stereotypical pattern that happens in the brain of someone who's experienced trauma is increased activity in the amygdala. And this is essentially the alarm center of the brain. So increased activity here is going to cause someone to be hypervigilant, always on alert, looking at everyone they walk by in the street as a possible attacker, or every situation as a potential disaster. And just hearing me talk about that, you can imagine how stressful that is. There's also excess activity in Brodmann's area 19, which is back in the occipital portion of the brain, and it registers images when they enter the brain. So it's as if, the visual area being activated, it's as if if there's any sort of traumatic flashback, as if that is being re-experienced again here and now. So there's this theme of sort of re-experiencing trauma in the present, even though it's in the past. And that also is due to more global changes, reducing activity in the left hemisphere, increasing activity in the right. So the left hemisphere has more activity related to organizing experiences into logical sequences, understanding that it was in the past. Right brain activity is more clearly in the present moment. And so that change in activity makes people, again, feel like they're experiencing trauma now, even if it was in the past. There's also diminished activity, like we talk about generally, diminished activity in the left hemisphere of the brain, diminished activity in Broca's area, which is a speech center. And that means there's reduced ability to put experience into words, which can make talk therapy less impactful. It can also make it difficult for someone to tell themselves a narrative about that trauma and tell themselves that, hey, it was in the past, and really kind of process it. There's diminished activity in the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex. So there's going to be decreased executive function, which has to do with decision-making, being able to delay gratification for better long-term outcomes in life. There's diminished relationship to the self, which another way of saying dissociation, disembodiment, a lack of connection with one's own body. Also the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. When there's diminished activity there, there's less context and meaning of experience, and a lack of timekeeping and reduced ability to parse past and future. So there's this sense that whatever's happening now is going to last forever, which of course can also be stressful. Finally, there's diminished activity in the thalamus, which is a relay station for sensation. So it's sort of like a bouncer at a crowded nightclub, will let some people in, but not others. And if that bouncer's gone, it could get overcrowded and there could be too many people in there and it's over the maximum number allowed by the fire code. And, that can lead to problems. It can be overcrowded. It can be chaotic. And same thing here. If the thalamus is downregulated, there's less filtering. So it kind of opens the floodgates for sensations from old traumas and can lead to these flashbacks. That's sort of the stereotypical pattern. There's one other stereotypical pattern, and that is dissociation, which is the manifestation of the biological freeze response, where virtually all brain areas are diminished. It's sort of the ultimate shutdown. It's when the higher level systems get overwhelmed, the body goes into that freeze response. It's playing possum, feigning death. So it's the ultimate dissociation and shutting down. And sometimes it feels like that's, in the face of threat, stress, challenge, it feels like that for the brain is kind of the last resort, the only place it can go. It can feign death and try to, hope to wake up later and still be alive. So that's the main patterns of activity in the brain there. And that, of course, also influences psychology and behavior. So a little bit of a different but also related topic. I want to turn now to psychology and behavior. So as we just talked about, these different patterns can lead to hypervigilance, like always being on alert. can lead to flashbacks and reliving the experience, can lead to dissociation. Also, patterns of attraction or addiction to dangerous or painful situations. People might be, because of trauma they've experienced in the past, they might act out in ways where they're trying to attempt to regain attachment or connection that wasn't there. Sometimes they've lost their sense of agency and ability to influence their world, and so they try to act out in ways to regain that sense of control. And so that can lead to, people cutting themselves, for example, or different things that Dr. van der Kolk talks about in The Body Keeps the Score. Talks, about some of these really, really difficult situations where people might turn to binge eating, high risk sex, drug use, excessive spending, reckless driving. Sometimes people internalize mistreatment as a feeling of not being worthy or feeling like they deserve to be treated badly. And so they're more likely to put themselves into situations where they will be abused again. It can lead to lead to obesity. Sometimes, he talks in the book about some female victims of abuse talking about wanting to be overweight so that they were overlooked and less likely to be attacked again. So really painful, difficult situations, but a profound impact on psychology and behavior there. And then, coming down further into the body and some of these other mechanisms whereby trauma can impact health. There's an effect on hormones and neurochemistry. Cortisol is profoundly dysregulated in people who have experienced trauma. They make more of it. It stays elevated for longer. It leads to many negative health outcomes. Remember, cortisol is about breaking down, breaking the body down to mobilize energy now, taking energy away from long-term growth and repair processes. So it's good to meet an immediate challenge, but having it elevated for too long leads to many negative health outcomes. There's also, in terms of some of the neurochemistry, issues with impaired serotonin. And serotonin is the neurotransmitter or neuromodulator associated with a feeling of satisfaction with what we already have. And there's less of that activity in people who have experienced trauma. So they're less able to be satisfied with their lives. And that, of course, can lead to depression and very, very challenging psychological issues there.
If you're ready to supercharge your practice, listen to this. Garrett and Team NeuFit have just released a new online course entitled Introduction to the NeuFit Method. In this detailed 8-hour course, you'll gain mastery of the fundamental techniques in our practice, including muscle testing and activations, nerve glides, and joint articulations. You'll also get introduced to our patented direct current stimulation device, the Newbie, an incredible machine that's empowered professionals just like you to help their patients heal, adapt, and grow faster than they ever thought possible. To learn more, go to www.neu.fit/learn. And now back to the show.
Turning to the immune system, there's a very interesting effect where trauma will influence the so-called memory cells in the immune system, and it makes them less able to identify self from non-self and more likely to attack the self, which can create autoimmune conditions. We talked about asthma earlier, but there's so many autoimmune conditions. Autoimmune conditions of the thyroid. MS is an autoimmune condition, which of course we talk a lot about within the NeuFit community. There's a I would say, epidemic of autoimmune conditions today, and trauma is certainly an influence that can increase the likelihood of autoimmune conditions. So something that we want to have on our radar. There's also, when we're talking about the body, one fascinating topic that is worth touching on, and that is epigenetics. And epigenetics can describe why there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma, how trauma can actually be passed on. In order to understand that, it's important to talk a little bit about what epigenetics is. So someone can have a gene, for example, there's different genes, alleles, which is the actual blueprint of the genes that, for instance, some related to serotonin. So we talk about a serotonin is associated with satisfaction with life and what things that we already have, as opposed to going out to get more or new things like that. Satisfaction with what we already have. And people can have genetically more or less activity of serotonin in their body. So it would have to do with the activity of the enzyme that clears serotonin so that it stays active for longer or shorter periods of time in the body. And people where it's active for shorter periods of time have greater likelihoods of depression. But if that person with the greater likelihood of depression, if they grow up in an environment where they're nurtured and cared for, that gene likely won't cause a problem. Whereas someone with that same gene who grows up in an environment of abuse, neglect, other traumas, they are going to be much more likely, far more likely to experience. So it's both the interaction of the genes and the environmental factors that people experience. There are also fascinating studies in rats that show how the mother's treatment of their babies sets the sensitivity of their stress response. And that gene can actually be passed on to their offspring. So how sensitive their stress response is can be influenced for generations based on how the babies are treated within the first day of their life. In humans, methylation patterns that turn genes off and on, those can be passed down. So there are mechanisms whereby experiences of trauma can adversely affect future generations. I thought that was a fascinating topic. So we've talked about some of the statistics around how rampant trauma is, talked about some of the changes that happen in the brain and the body. And I think it's important now, of course, to turn to how one might be able to treat trauma to help people work through the lingering challenges and problems that stem from traumatic experiences. So in terms of establishing the conceptual basis here, there's a great quote shared in the Body Keeps the Score that I want to read for you here. And I think it does set the stage very effectively for what we're going to talk about next. So the quote begins, "Nobody can treat a war, abuse, rape, molestation, or any other horrendous event. What has happened cannot be undone. But what can be dealt with are the imprints of the trauma on body, mind, and soul." And so that to me is another way of saying the same sort of thing that we talk about here at NeuFit. We talk about how with injuries, it's not as much about the original injury, but the body's response to it. That's the imprint of that injury on body, mind, and soul. We see delayed recovery from injury. We see chronic pain because of that imprint, and helping people identify where that imprint lives, through mapping, scanning around, finding where that lives, and changing, optimizing, re-educating, recalibrating that imprint neurologically, that neurological pattern, is able to make a profound difference for people. I think that we certainly will talk about some other parallels here and actual ways that the newbie can help and has helped. But I want to also more broadly and conceptually kind of talk about the landscape here for treatment here too, to set the stage. So there's, I think, 3 categories of treatment that we can talk about. One is top down. So talk therapy, neurofeedback, working kind of directly with the brain and the psychology. There's bottom up approaches, working with the body. So yoga, therapeutic touch, massage, the newbie. And then the third category would be medication. And there's value in all 3. Different treatments from all 3 categories have been shown to be helpful for people. But when we're talking about the newbie, of course, we're going to be more of a bottom-up, body-based approach. Also, in terms of treatment, there's a couple themes that are really important. One is that we have the ability to regulate our own physiology in powerful ways, and it can be reclaimed even after it's been lost. In order to do that, it's necessary to have some experience of safety. But this is one of the biggest themes, is that learning to regain that ability to regulate one's physiology, learning to be able to find calm and focus first in a safe, less challenging environment is the first step. And then treatment involves being able to learn to maintain that sense of calm while being exposed to images or thoughts, sensations, sounds that remind someone of the traumatic event. So that is a key. And again, there's a pattern there where it's similar to mapping. We scan around in the body, find the areas where there are those painful sensations, those reactions, and then learning to to move and maintain a sense of calm, even in the face of those really challenging, uncomfortable, alarming inputs. One other component of successful treatment, or one other theme, involves learning to be fully alive in the present, or in other words, not stuck in the past. This involves an element of mindfulness. It's necessary to experience and be aware of and tune into sensations in the present moment. So now we'll turn to different interventions and methods that actually have been shown to work to help people who have experienced trauma. The first one I'll talk about, I've also tried it personally, is EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprogramming. And EMDR is a powerful way to bring up traumatic memories and integrate them and desensitize the emotional charge or the response to them. So it involves literally bringing up, just like we talk about mapping, finding the hot spots, finding the painful areas, and then turning up the machine, eliciting that reaction. EMDR involves actually thinking about the painful memory, bringing it up, and then doing eye movements, saccadic eye movements, back and forth, left and right, in a way that desensitizes the reaction to that, allows people to integrate it, to hold the memory, but without the reaction to it, without that emotional charge, being able to handle the input, but changing the output, neurologically speaking. And it can be done without necessarily needing to talk about it. Dr. Van der Kolk in the book talks about how you don't even necessarily have to have a very trusting relationship with a therapist in order to do this, because a lot of it can just be the individual receiving treatment thinking about that, holding the memory or the image or thought in their head, doing the eye movements, working with whatever comes up next, because there's this element of associations that will come up, and it's sort of working sequentially on different things that come up in one's mind. And it's a very powerful, in my own experience, it helped me working through different fears, these topics that were very emotionally charged. I would bring up, do the eye movements, and it would just, I would feel a psychological reaction of 7 or 8 out of 10, and then would go down to a 1 or a 2 out of 10. My level of fear or anxiety or charge response to that. So it was very, very profound. And it's been shown to help many people dealing with residue, with these residual experiences and challenges from trauma. So definitely one dimension. Another category of treatments that are very successful for people dealing with trauma are somatic or body-based treatments like yoga, like massage. Obviously, broad categories, different techniques fitting under there, but a big part of the benefit is increasing perception of the body, awareness, being in the present moment, feeling sensations, tuning in. That's a big part of what is needed to help people work through the traumas of, abuse, neglect, war, car accident, etc. Different things that can happen, loss of a loved one. These are, it's very important to be able to tune in here. And that's literally an improvement in proprioception, which is, again, another parallel, something we talk about often with the newbie and the NeuFit method. So again, as to, mention again from maybe a slightly different angle, I do think there are profound ways whereby we can help people suffering from the effects of trauma. There's a few other treatment approaches that I just want to mention to help complete the picture here before we sign off. So one is neurofeedback, which is a top-down approach, and it involves literally putting electrodes on the scalp and measuring electrical activity in specific areas of the brain. It's possible to identify where there's excess activity or diminished activity, and then possible to specifically shut down and calm hyperactive areas, to reactivate underactive areas. It's very promising. I'm actually about to begin a series of my own neurofeedback treatments, and I imagine I'll have some interesting experiences to report to you at some point in the future, something I'm excited to try as part of my own journey here. And a couple others that are worth mentioning. One is psychedelics. These fell out of favor with the war on drugs and different things, but I think are getting a lot more acceptance mainstream. And there's work being done with MDMA, with psilocybin, with ketamine. I won't talk a ton about that here, but if anyone wants to learn more, there's great podcasts from people like Andrew Huberman and Tim Ferriss. Great episodes they've done on the topic of psychedelics, and that has led to profound breakthroughs for people suffering with treatment-resistant depression and various challenges related to trauma here. So something that definitely is worth looking into. Two other things that Dr. Vanderkolk mentioned in the Body Keeps the Score book that I thought were worth mentioning. One is internal family systems, and this is something he described as a type of talk therapy that can actually be even more impactful. We talk about limitations, for example, where the speech areas of the brain are diminished and have diminished activity in people who experience trauma. So talk therapy might be less powerful in many cases. But this is one that's interesting. And internal family systems talks about these kind of internal family members, and he talks about how our brains can have essentially different programs or modules running at the same time. So it describes this subjective experience that if you've ever had, I know I've had the experience of like, part of me feels this way, but part of me also feels that way. Part of me thinks we should stay here, but part of me thinks it would be a really good idea to go there. And it actually describes that, that exact experience and leads to a form of self-coaching or self-leadership about how we can coach those different modules or programs or different parts of ourselves and help them become more aligned. And it's a really, really powerful, interesting technique that was worth mentioning. Another one that he mentioned is theater, about how acting can give people a chance to explore a range of emotions, express a range of emotions, but to do it in a way where there is safe psychological distance between them and those emotions, because it's, they're playing a part. And so that was a really interesting one. And again, just wanted to mention those to help you get a more complete picture of the current field of trauma therapy. And I hope you found this as interesting as I did, between the neuroscience of what happens in the brains of people who've experienced trauma, brains and bodies of people. And the statistics around how rampant trauma is, other effects on the body, and different ways that we might be able to help. And again, my hope here is that we are able to find ways to use this powerful technology to help people who are dealing with the negative effects of trauma, the body-based effects, the pain, chronic pain. Certainly, we talk a lot about in our community here in NeuFit Nation, but also the other adverse health consequences. And I think there's really wonderful opportunities to help people, especially when there just aren't as many good answers, or where it's very challenging and we need more tools, because oftentimes in the Body Keeps the Score, Dr. Vanderkolk talks about how it often is a combination of these different treatments that help people. And for some people, one of them might be the breakthrough, for some of them might be the other, but it also has to do with things they've done in the past that get them to that point where they're ready to have a breakthrough. And I just, in that landscape, in that mix, I think there's a strong possibility that the newbie and the NeuFit method can play a big role. So I invite anyone listening to this to leave comments, to share experiences, whether it's directly on the podcast here or on our mastermind calls, or sending us a note. Send me a note to talk with our team. I also hope that perhaps this will lead to further opportunities for collaboration, for research, so we can learn more about how these approaches can help people dealing with trauma. And for everyone listening to this, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you've found this as interesting as I do. And I really do, as I said, really do look forward to continuing the conversation on this topic. We'll have at least one more episode as a fast follow here, where I've lined up an interview with a trauma expert, and I'm really excited to share that one with you as well. And yes, look forward to continuing the conversation. And until next time, goodbye. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Undercurrent podcast. And I really appreciate all of you in NeuFit Nation.
Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we release future episodes.